Hi everyone, welcome to my second video, and for today we are going to talk about Miss Saigon, right? And I really enjoyed reading your reflections, your first assignments. Thank you for that. But I guess I will start by talking about literature, right, and fiction, right? When we say fiction, it's almost like automatic, right? That it's not supposed to be real, right? It's sort of made up, right? Um, and so literature, which includes novels, poetry, right, and plays, right? The musical that we watched, any kind of like theater performance, right? Even movies, right? TV shows. These are all considered fiction, right? Um, so I just want to kind of like reiterate that, right? Obviously, fiction is not real, but there is a way in which fiction is presented as real, right? And we would call that kind of like a realist representation. and and the difference between the real, right, and the realist is that when something is connected with an ist or an ism, right, realism, communism, socialism, whatever sort of like ism, right, um, that usually means that it's sort of, there is kind of like a political movement, there's an ideological movement, there's sort of an artistic movement, right? These things are not separate, right? Like artistic movement can be ideological and political, right? And so yeah, so like anything that has an ism, right, or has an ist, realist, right? That means that they're sort of, that they have an agenda, right? That there is, for lack of a better term, it's a propaganda, right? They want something to appear, for realism, for example, right? They want something to appear as real only because they want they want to convince you that what they're saying is real, right? So there is an agenda to sort of like convince you that what is supposed to be just fiction, right? They want you they want to convince you that it's real, right? So you want to be careful, and this is something that that's good to learn for 1B class, because when you go into 1C, 1C is mostly sort of like dedicated on close reading literature, right? So you will mostly be analyzing literature in your 1C class, right? So it's good to understand literature in terms of, not that we should never look at it as real, right? But they are representations of something that might be real, right? They're representations of experience, right? So in a way, from that sort of like point of view, you want to treat literature as something that's full of symbols, right? And so these symbols, they're not real, but they are representing something, right? And they are arranged in a way that that you can kind of connect them or disconnect them and make assumptions about what is the purpose of these symbols, right? The characters are symbols, right? The setting is a symbol, right? The pattern of the narrative, right? There is a purpose to that. And so you want to be aware of all of these sort of like symbols and the structures of the symbols, right? Going into interpreting literature, right? And Miss Saigon is, of course, literature. So that said, right, as symbols, it is our job then. So we are sort of critics, right? And we sort of we interpret, right, these symbols as critics, as people who write about literature, who argue about literature, right? That's what we're doing. Who make arguments, we make our positions, right? We try to solve problems, right? So as critics, our job is to interpret these symbols, right, and make kind of connections, um, in order to sort of in order to kind of um, so we have an argument, right, and then we look at our interpretation of the literature and sort of use that to kind of like back up our argument, right? So what we're doing is interpreting, right? Interpreting these symbols that is a representation of reality, right? Um, and so since we are only interpreting, right, there's no right or wrong interpretation. There might be interpretations that are stronger than others because the patterns are more consistent, right? But you know, as with any good literature, the interpretation is supposed to be always open, right? And so, you know, my opinion of it, other people, other critics' opinion of it could be different, right? Your opinion of what we're watching or reading could be different, right? And that's based on the way we interpret, right? These texts or these, you know, these plays. And that interpretation is not necessarily wrong, right? Because that interpretation is based on, you know, what we know, right? How we sort of like structure the world based on how we understand it, right? All right, so just background, right? Miss Saigon was first performed in the West End in London, right, in 1989. And the music, right, which is everything, like there's almost like no script other than music. So it's like a proper musical where everything, even their dialogues are sung, right? So the music and the lyrics were written by Alain Boublil and Richard Maltby, right? And also Claude Michel Schoenberg, right? And these, they might be familiar to you because they also wrote the musical Les Miserables, right? And so they're kind of big deal musical people, right? Right, and so first played in the West End in London in 1898, or sorry, 1989, and then it went on. It did really well in London, right? And then it went on to play in Broadway in New York in 1991, and there was there was a bit of a scandal when it when they moved the play to New York, because the person playing the engineer, right, who is a Vietnamese kind of pimp, right, he in the London version, he was played by a white actor, right, and in London that was not a problem, right, because you know it's London. But when it came to America and they kept that actor to play, they kept that white actor to play the Vietnamese engineer. It became a problem because this was a time when Asian American academics and and activists, right, were really very active, right, in making sure that there is Asian American representation in popular culture, right, and not just that there's Asian American representation, right, but there is, like a positive Asian American representation in American culture, right, and so the fact that they had you've probably heard of blackface, right? Usually it's just tradition in American cinema where white actors with, you know, put on black makeup to play um, black characters, right? In in turn, right, they are critical that what the white actor playing the Vietnamese engineer is doing is playing a yellow face, right? Which means that you're taking a white actor and having them play an Asian character, right? And this has kind of like a racist a history to it, right? And also not just racist history, but it took away, like on a more sort of like practical level, it literally took away jobs from Asian American performers, right? There's not enough Asian American actors, and then the small number of parts, right, that that is written for Asian American characters would then be played by white actors, right? So um, this is sort of like a problem that they're trying to sort of fight against, right? And so it became kind of like a big scandal in 1991, right, in Broadway, to a point where the producers of the show had to threaten uh, to not play in Broadway, right? Um, and this became a problem because that would mean that the and majority of the actors in Miss Saigon were already Asian. Not they were not mostly they were not an Asian American, right? They were actually Asians from Asia, mostly Filipino performers. And I'll go back to that. There's something to that too, that they're mostly Filipinos, right? And so by threatening to pull the production of Miss Saigon in Broadway, right? The Asian American activists were afraid that a lot of Asians too are going to lose their jobs, right? If this doesn't go on, so they're sort of like they were in this weird spot, right? Where do we have to stick with our guns, or do we allow this to go on and let the Asian actors, right, not lose their jobs, right? But ultimately, they ended up kind of reconciling, quote unquote, and Miss Saigon went on to play in Broadway, and it did very well. It made a lot of money, right? And so the during this time, right? So the version that you saw was in 2000, right? So that's like 10 years after that Broadway drama, right? And Lea Salonga, who's a Filipino actress slash singer, and she's kind of everything, and she's wonderful. I grew up watching her, and I'm also I'm a big fan of her. So she was the original Kim, right, in West End in London, and also in Broadway in New York, right? And then they performed in the Philippines in 2000, which is the version that you saw, and Lea Salonga purposely sort of went back to play Kim, right? Just because it was important for the play, for her to play that part in the production of Miss Saigon in the Philippines, right? So that was kind of like an important thing for her. So she went back to play her to play the part, right? 10 years later, right? But so to go back to so Schoenberg and Bublil sort of composed this musical, right? And now they wanted to go to Asia and um, find performers, right, who would then play these roles that they've written, right? And I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of the characters in Miss Saigon in the past and even today, there is a version like I think in the last 2 years, Miss Saigon was reproduced, but you will notice that a lot of the characters are Filipinos, right? Which is which is interesting, because why not Vietnamese, right? When the setting is Vietnam War, right? So there is a kind of a history to this, right? And so when the producers went to Asia to look for talents, right, to play Miss Saigon, they went all over Asia, right? They went all over Southeast Asia, but they ultimately sort of found kind of refuge, or in terms of performers, right, in the Philippines, right? And so they started just staying in the Philippines and auditioning Filipinos, right? Instead of making it kind of like an Asian-wide audition, right? And that's not a coincidence, right? And it's not because Filipinos are better than other Asians, right? But if you're not familiar with Filipino history, Philippines was an American colony, right, since 1898, right? So for 1898 to 1947, right, the Philippines was American colony, and then after that it became sort of what you would call a neo-colony, which means that the Philippines has been given its independence after World War II, but that economic relationship, right, between the Philippines and America would be maintained, right? So the Philippines was still dependent economically to America after the independence, post World War II, right? So that would be so from colonialism to neo-colonialism, right? That's kind of like 120-year relationship, right, between Philippines and the United States. And so in that time, in the last 100 years, right, that the Philippines was under colonial and neo-colonial rule, obviously part of that colonial rule, right, was to teach English, right, in the Philippines. So the Americans were the first one to build, public schools in the Philippines, and the public schools were taught by American teachers, right, that they had to take from America and bring them to. They were called the Thomasites, right? They were American teachers who were brought into the Philippines from America to teach, Filipinos. And there is kind of like a racist background to this, because the point of them sort of like educating the Filipinos was because they want to mediate resistance, because Filipino revolutionaries were fighting American military, right? Because they didn't want to be colonized again, right? They were colonized by Spain before America, and then now they're being colonized by America. So Filipinos resisted against that, and part of fighting that resistance was to educate Filipinos to learn English, right? And then the second kind of like racist aspect of that was Filipinos were not considered as full humans, right? They were considered kind of like the backwards people, or there's kind of like savages, right, that needed education to become quote unquote humans, right? So that was sort of like part of the need to educate the Filipinos. And this is a trend, right, in colonialism, that they would educate the colonial subjects in order to make them more human, but also to make them servants, right? Um, so American education was implemented in the Philippines, and along with American education was also American culture, right? Hollywood became a big thing. Filipinos would listen to American music, American TV shows, American movies, right? Um, and also, part of educational training was also military training. That is American military training, American kind of like medical training, right? And that is why if you, there's a stereotype that most of the nurses, it's not a stereotype, it's pretty much true, right? A lot of the nurses in hospitals here in America are Filipinos, and that's not a coincidence, right? That's because Filipinos were trained by Americans in the Philippines. Historically, right, they became more sort of like desirable, right, nurses to come to America because they were already trained the American way back home, right? Right. So there's a lot of kind of like American aspect in Filipino life already in the Philippines, right? If you go there, there's American music playing everywhere. Karaoke music is full of American music, right? Filipinos are very good at imitating, right, American music, American singers, right? And so this imitation, right, this like how good Filipinos are at imitating not just American language, right, but also American music, right? This kind of the way that the Filipinos have been formed by sort of like the West, by the Americans throughout the history of colonialism, made sort of like this Filipino performers more desirable, right, for Western sort of musical producers, like these producers of Miss Saigon. So when they went to the Philippines and they saw all this talent, right, that's like so good at imitating American music and Western music, and so good at speaking English, right? Like Lea Salonga. I mean, Lea Salonga came from a rich family, wealthy family, so she was very well educated. She was sent to the best schools. But Lea Salonga pretty much spent most of her life in the Philippines, but she spoke very Americanized English, right? If you look at videos of her auditioning, right, it's like she didn't even have a Filipino accent, right? So that became also part of the desirability, right? That not just that they're good at imitating the music, right? But it's easier to work with them, right? Because they already speak the language, right? So all of that, right, plays into why, why is it that a lot of the actors in Miss Saigon, right, are Filipinos? And it baffles a lot of people because not a lot of people know the history of the Philippine and American sort of colonial relationship, right? And so that's part of what interests me, right? Because of that relationship between Filipino performers, right, and Miss Saigon. So all of that is to say, right, that that's why I'm also like personally, I like Miss Saigon, right? And some of you might also like it, right? Because there's a lot of Filipinos there, and also like the music. If you notice, the music is very much Disneyfied, right? And I'll go to some details about that later on. But yeah, just think of the music, the songs, right? There's even that one scene where the engineer right? And I remember a scene by Ursula from The Little Mermaid, right? The octopus evil character in Little Mermaid, right? There was a song, and I'm gonna try to find those scenes and put them together, if I can figure out how to to do this whole editing thing. But yeah, there was a part where the engineer was singing that reminded me of Ursula from The Little Mermaid, right? And that's not a coincidence because the way that Miss Saigon is actually sort of like the music, right, is very much in that tradition of kind of like this like Disney spectacular kind of appealing to everybody, right? This kind of like positive, beautiful music, yeah. So yeah, so like keep that in mind, like the Disneyfication of of Miss Saigon, right? And we all kind of like grew up, even I grew up in the Philippines, but I grew up watching The Little Mermaid, The Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, right? So we all have this like nostalgic relationship to that kind of music, right? That kind of love story, the kind of romantic narrative, right? But the music, right, specifically, so, which is why a lot of us easily get drawn to the music of Miss Saigon, right? Because it has that same appeal. Um, right. So that said, right, we like Miss Saigon, but what I'm actually interested in is criticizing Miss Saigon. Yeah, and you can have it both ways. You can like it because of nostalgia or whatever reason, right? We just like it. Like the music sounds good to us, right? Whatever your reason is, it's perfectly fine to like it. But then for the sake of this class, right, we are like in this class, we want to be critical and we want to analyze and we want to interpret these symbols, right? From from the readings, from the things that we're gonna watch, right? So for the sake of being critical, right, I will kind of now talk about what the problems are with Miss Saigon. All right, so I will start with how Miss Saigon is actually not an original story, right? It has a history, right? In terms of like what kind of narrative it's imitating, right? Right. So in I think uh, the late 19th century. Um, I'll try to correct that later if I have that wrong. So late 19th century, right? So there's an opera by Giacomo Puccini called Madame Butterfly, right? And so the story is about so it's an opera. Um, it's about a white European man, right, who goes to Japan and has a romantic relationship with a Japanese woman, right? And then they have this kind of like melodramatic love affair, which ends up in Madame Butterfly. Butterfly, that's the Madame Butterfly is the Japanese character. It ends up, Madame Butterfly committing suicide when she realizes that her lover will never return to her, right? Um, so So the figure of Madame Butterfly, so you can probably see the connection, right, between Madame Butterfly by Puccini and Miss Saigon, right? And so American soldier goes to Vietnam to fight the war, meets Kim, have an intimate kind of, romantic relationship, and then Kim realizes that she can't be with, American soldier because American soldier is already married. Um, so she sacrifices her life for the sake of the son, right? And also for yeah, because she felt like she can't be like she can't exist anymore because the man that she loved can't be with her anymore, right? Um, and so there's a lot of problems with that, right? So this idea, right, of the Asian female character as being portrayed as weak, right, or docile, right? So this has a history, right? And like I said, right, the Madame Butterfly opera by Puccini, sort of that's how they portrayed Chuchu-san. That's the name of that's Madame Butterfly's sort of like Japanese name. Um, so she was portrayed as this kind of like weak character, right, who is incapable um, of being, right, incapable of being alive, right, without the help of the savior white man, right. So that kind of like representation of Asian women, but also Asian characters in general in literature, right? It has a very long history, right? And so I want to kind of like now draw into sort of that stereotype, right? And that kind of like racist representation of Asian people, Asian Americans. Not just in literature, right, but in the history of the United States, right? We probably all know that America has a very long history of racism against Native Americans, against Black people, but also against Asians, against Latinos, right? Or who whatever kind of like other you are. You could be a female other, right? Or you can be sort of queer, right, and you're considered other, right? And so we have a long history of this country has a long history of discrimination, right, against whoever is considered other, right, and that other is usually historically been an other than a white man. So if you're not a straight white man in America in the history, right, you're considered an other, right. And so, right, so Asians have been sort of, there's been two ways, right, that Asians have been represented in American literature, right. One is this kind of like weak, helpless, right, character who needs to be saved, who needs a savior, right, otherwise he or she is going to die, right, or will kill herself, right. And then there's also this other way of representing Asians in this country as being a threat, right. And this goes back to the 19th century. There was a legal court ruling called Chinese Exclusion Act, right, that legally banned Chinese people from coming to America because they were considered a threat, right? They were taking away Americans' jobs, right? Because Chinese people were immigrating to work here in America, right? And so there's a long history in this idea of, it's not just Trump, right? Like talking about, oh, the Mexicans are taking away our jobs, right? There's a long history of this idea of immigrants, right, taking away white people's jobs, right? And so there is that. So like this, Chinese Exclusion Act was implemented in order to ban Chinese people because they were a threat to American workers, right? And World War II happened, right? And Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and then this became like caused the Americans to fear the Japanese, right? And then because of that fear, they even the internment camps in World War II, where they pretty much took every anyone who's thought of as Japanese, right, in America and in Canada, in the United States and in Canada, right? And they're brought into concentration camps because everyone became a threat to becoming a spy or working for the Japanese government, right? So there was internment camps for Japanese people during World War II, right? Because they were considered as a threat. And these are Americans. These are Japanese Americans, right? Who are now sort of being put into these kind of like prisons, right? Because they were seen as threats, right? And just rallied everyone. So there's that, right? And there's a term for this, right? It's called yellow peril, right? And also there's this idea of techno-orientalism, right? In which Asia is seen as this very technologically advanced continent, or Asian countries are considered as very technologically advanced, especially kind of like Korea, South Korea, Japan, China, right? Being very technologically advanced, right? And they could become a threat because, Asians are going to become a bunch of robots, or they will have robots, or whatever, racist stuff. So there's also that aspect of it. So there is this history, right, of Asians being, on the one hand, seen as represented in literature as weak, right, as in need of saving, right. The same logic with the Filipino savage, right, who needed education, right. So because they're backwards, because they're weak, they need the help, right. So that is kind of like the racist logic of right, of sort of like of helping them, of being their savior, right, because they don't know better, right. Never mind that, China and a lot of Asian countries have a long history of their own civilizations, right, that that is way older and way more complex than American history, right. But apparently they also need saving, right. But anyway, so there is that history, right, of representation and as being weak and or a threat, right. Right, and there was even like a point where a Japanese immigrant, and this was kind of, I think, early 20th century, a Japanese immigrant was trying to apply for citizenship, and he was obviously denied because at that time only white people can become American citizen, right? Because like at that time only like black people were sort of not allowed to become citizen, right? So you had to be white to become citizen in order to exclude black people. But then this Japanese immigrant argued that, I'm Japanese and I have white skin, and he literally had white skin too, right? So he argued that to the court, like, why wouldn't you count me as a white person, right, when I have white skin? And so this caused a lot of, it caused a lot of chaos at that time in that court, right? Because that's true. Like why? And so they had to, because of that, they had to kind of like tweak the law to say that you have to be a white person of European descent, right, to become eligible for American citizenship, right? So, which means you, Japanese white person, cannot become citizen, right? So, there's a long history of this exclusions, right, and discriminations, and these sort of like discriminations, and then the link between these discriminations and representation in literature, right, is that however, like how Asians are treated in person in real life, right? um, if that is in reflection to how they are seen in movies, right? So if they're seen as weak and threatening on TV, right, then it must be justifiable that they are also seen as weak and threatening in real life, right? So that's the connection, right, between why it's important to recognize representation um, in literature, right, and how that affects real life, right. All right, so just to summarize where we're at, I know I'm kind of like giving you a lot of information and a lot of historical backgrounds that you might not be familiar with, and it's perfectly fine that you're not familiar with it, because part of sort of the logic of colonialism and racism is that the government would also, and I sound like a conspiracy theorist right now, right? So part of the tactic of colonialism is to hide violence, right? So you don't read a lot of violences, especially the history of the violence in the Philippines when America went there, where almost a million Filipinos died in the genocide, right? When America went to conquer the Philippines, um, that's nowhere to be found in American history, because then that would make America look really bad, right? And it's in their best interest to hide that in order to justify the fact that they were out, conquering Cuba, conquering Puerto Rico, conquering Hawaii, conquering Guam, right? So by hiding violence, right, they're able to justify, um, these actions, right? So yes, it's perfectly fine that you don't know this, because it's been hidden from you, right? And so, right, so let me just kind of like go back to what we've been talking about, right? So first, just to summarize, we talked about literature as fiction, therefore, it's composed of symbols and representations, right? It's realist, but it's not real, right? It can be interpreted in different ways, right? And then, so the issue of liking, right, Madame Butterfly, because it's doing the kind of things that we like, especially the music that we grew. It's very similar to what the music was, when we were growing up, right? So it's perfectly fine to like it and also to criticize it, right? For those two things to be happening at once. And then the issue of the story of Miss Saigon is based on the opera by Giacomo Puccini, called Madame Butterfly, right? That portrays this weak Asian woman who needs saving, right? Uh, from the white European man. And if she can't get that savior, then she'll just kill herself, right? So this representation of Asian characters, right, as weak, is very much in the tradition of literary representation, right? So I talked about the history of racism against Asian Americans and Asian immigrants, right? As both based on how they've been represented as weak on the one hand and as threatening, right, on the other hand, right? So they need to be saved, but then we also need to protect ourselves from them, right, because they are threatening, right? So this is not this dynamic of the weak and the threatening, right, is actually something that goes hand in hand, right? Because someone is weak, we are not just obligated, but we can make ourselves sort of responsible for helping them, for saving them at all cost, right? At all cost. It could be through violence, right? That we have to save them, right? But then, as a threat, right, we are able to justify violence against them because they are threatening, right? So this is a way of like justifying violence because someone is threatening, right? Right. So then we also talked about the Disney quality of the play, of the musical, right? And yeah, if you want to just go back to the main, especially there's the two songs from the first act, right? Two songs by Kim and Chris, the military man. Oh my god, I'm like blanking on the name of the songs. But anyway, so there's the two songs there, but just between the two of them. And those are the most popular songs from Miss Saigon. I'm trying to remember the names. Okay, never mind, whatever. Yeah, so like listen to that song again and just kind of pay attention to like how Disney-like that music is, right? And it's so strange that you're watching kind of like this very horrific thing, but the music is very like Disney and like childish, right? And then the subject is very horrific, right? What does that do? Right. So now I want to focus on the theater, right? So this was the West End, right, in London. That's kind of on Broadway in New York, right? These are like two of the most famous kind of areas, right, where musicals and plays are performed. And traditionally, the theater, right, is very much a privileged space, right? And traditionally, and even today, right, you go to Broadway in New York, and it costs a lot to see a play or to see a musical, right? Or here in LA, right, it costs like $100. That's still, so there is a way in which the theater, right, and traditionally the theater has always been sort of for the wealthy, right? And so if you can afford the theater, then you get to see the theater, right? And the consequence of that is that the creator of plays and musicals, right, the producers know that that's their audience, right? And traditionally that's, rich white people in America at least, right? Or rich white people in England, right, in this case. And so knowing that, right, you would kind of need to cater to that too, right? And so, and the tradition of spectator, the viewer, the audience, right, and the play or so the word spectacular, right, comes from the word is related to the spectator who's watching that which is spectacular, right? So the spectacle, right? So there's a spectator, and then there's the spectacle, that the spectacular thing that you're observing, right? And traditionally, that dynamic, right, between spectator and spectacle is a separate one, right, in which you are observing something, right, and you're supposed to kind of like feel, and you're supposed to be assured, right, and you're supposed to feel smart, right, and you're supposed to understand, right? And you're supposed to become empathetic, right? And you're supposed to, gain all of this knowledge while just laying back, right? And not participating, just taking everything in, right? Um, so that's kind of the traditional dynamic between spectator and spectacle, right? That you never cross the 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 fourth wall, right? So there's the three walls in the spectacle, and then the fourth wall is the wall that divides the audience and the stage, right? um, and so that division, right, doesn't allow for interaction, right? And so traditionally, what they produce as spectacles, right, are this just like these things that like make you feel good, right? It's just like look at like Miss Saigon, right? There's that epic kind of that dance number, right, by the Northern Vietnamese army, right? It's very spectacular, right? And then the musicals are very spectacular, right? And that epic kind of helicopter scene, right? That scene gets written a lot about, right? Where it's just like a helicopter coming down. That's like the most anticipated scene in that musical, right? This like helicopter, like loud noise, propeller. And then it was cool too how they, the point of view sort of like shifted, right? So like the army from the inside of the gate, right? Like the gate would open so that the people became on the other, who was on the other side will be on the front, and then vice versa, right? So that's like part of the spectacle, right? So by making Miss Saigon this kind of like spectacular thing, right? They're also sort of like appealing to a privileged audience, right? And saying that this is what happened in Vietnam War, right? And just stay back and enjoy the show, right? Pretty much is what it's saying, and like appreciate the spectacle, right? And there's a lot of things about the Vietnam War that's not portrayed there, right? It like in the like a typical kind of naive understanding of Miss Saigon would be to say, oh, it's a story about, you know, a good, Vietnamese girl who falls in love with a good American soldier, right? And we were supposed to sympathize, right? Sympathize towards Kim and the American soldier, right? And their love story, right? That's supposed to be the focus of Miss Saigon, right? But then what that does, by focusing on that, by making that the spectacle, right, the love story, by making the love story the spectacle, what it's hiding, right, is the fact that the Vietnam War was actually, caused by the United States. The United States need to expand, right? This was kind of like the war, kind of like a short kind of like historical background is right. The Americans, the United States, was defending the south of Vietnam, right, against the north of Vietnam. The north of Vietnam, this was during the Cold War, right? So the north of Vietnam was turning into a sort of like a communist leadership, right? And so the United States wanted to defend the South, who doesn't want communist leadership, right? And that intervention by the United States is not necessarily innocent. Like, it's not like, oh, we're just like out there to help, right? It's never that. The United States would not spend all that money and all that energy, right, if there was nothing there for them, right? So part of why the United States helped was, they needed to establish that they're powerful, right? And the United States needed to gain more territories in order to expand as a country, and to expand as a capitalist country, and to have relationships in Asia where they could exploit cheap labor and cheap resources, right? And that would be useful to feed into American capitalism, right? And the result now is, the factories, like all this cheap labor, right? So like that's part of why America had interest in Asia, right? Was to build a relationship in Asia, right? That will make it easier for Americans to extract resources from Asia. And so that's kind of like the alternative or the alternative motive, right? So that gets hidden, right? Because we are too caught up in the spectacle of the love story, right? And so, right, by not focusing on the love story, you can actually kind of like see, right, or like you can see like whoever's in the peripheries, right, like who would be the opposite of Kim, right? Kim is this like pure kind of like demure, lovable Asian, right? But then the alternate would be the prostitutes, the sex workers, right? So the sex workers don't get anything. Kim gets, even though she dies in the end, right? She gets she gets to she gets to have a relationship with a good American soldier, right? She gets to have the American kid, right? So it's like it's favoring, right, a certain kind of a woman, right? And then the sex workers are just, they don't get anything, right? So there are a lot of ways, right, that you can kind of interpret Miss Saigon, right, and see, by creating a spectacle, right, because it like appeals so much to our desire to want to hear Disney music, right, to want to see this kind of like spectacular shows, right? Like what that's doing is actually hiding something, right? When something is too bright in front of you, right, you want to be curious what's behind that brightness, right? What is it hiding, right? So that would be a question for you, the observer, right? Right. So what I want to offer, right, is a way of watching, right? Especially for our class, right? Like sometimes we just want to watch because we want to feel good, and we want to just lay back, and I do that too. Don't get me wrong, right? I like to see spectacles. I like Game of Thrones, right? That's like Game of Thrones is like spectacle galore, right? Spectacle of violence, spectacle of sex, spectacle of incest, right? Like all this, and they pay so much money to like create this, to make this spectacle very realistic, right? Right. So I perfectly understand that sometimes we just want to like sit back and enjoy the show, right? But for the sake of this class, because this is a critical class, right? We can't just be that kind of audience, right? Who will just sit back, right? We have to be we have to break the wall, right? And we have to watch with an eye, right, for criticism, right? At least for this class. And when you watch your own thing, then you don't have to be critical. Although I hope you're still critical, right? Having learned something from the class. But yeah, specifically for our class, right, I want you to be critical of what you watch, right? Miss Saigon, later on we're going to watch Yellowface. Yeah, and so like I don't want you to be just kind of sitting back and taking it all in, right? Although that's part of it, right? Also sit back and take it all in. But that, and then on the other hand, also sort of try to understand what patterns you're seeing, what sort of like interpretations you can make, right? When something is too spectacular, what is, not highlighted, right? I'm very much interested, right, in like for every surface, right, there's always something going on behind the surface, right? And so, right, so dig deeper, right? What's not spectacular, right? A lot of times, what's behind the spectacle is more important, right, to think about. Right. So, right, so what I offer is, like watching while also being critical, right? This went way longer than I expected, and so I'm gonna try to edit it so it's not too long, but okay. So let me know if you have questions and set up meetings with me, email me with a meeting time. If something that I said is not clear to you, or you want me to expand more on anything, right, or you just want to talk, whatever, just email me, right, and schedule time. So for assignment 2, it's possible that I'm not going to be able to upload this video until Thursday noon. And so, because I got a little behind, and so I will extend the deadline of your assignment, of the second assignment, to Sunday, right? Instead of it being due Saturday, and I'll email you to remind you about this too. So assignment 2 is now due Sunday, right? I don't know what date that is, but it's Sunday, the 12th, yeah. So SA2 is due, and then on my initial email I said 300 to 400 words, and I feel like some people want to say more. So yeah, like you can go up to 500, so 3 to 500 words for the response on Miss Saigon, right? And feel free to just write about your initial impression before listening to me, or you could also incorporate what I said, right, into your assignment, right? So if you observed something that's like kind of like Disney, then you want to talk about that, by all means, right? And also, this is a short assignment, and this is a very long play. It's like 2 hours, right? So you can't talk about everything. So what I would suggest is like pick a theme, pick a scene, right? Pick a song, pick like a small part, right? Pick the ending, just the last 2 minutes, and talk about that. Talk about what it's doing. Talk about what's going on there and what your interpretation is of that, right? So yeah, like I said, there's no wrong or right answer again for these assignments, right? As long as you give me something, you'll get the full credit. And it's okay. And so it's possible that I might send another short video on Sunday. Right. Or maybe I'll just email you. We'll see. I'll let you know. Because I want to like maybe add something more, or like say something about how we move forward from here, since we're going to start reading the St. Martin's Guide next week, right? I'll see. I'll email you. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. And yeah, just email me if you have any more questions. All right. Thank you.